find the athlete or person that you want to be. There's a lot of lessons that you learn as an 8, 9, 10-year-old that you take with you. I guess going as far back as I can actually remember, in regards to sports, my dad was a pretty keen rugby league player. Now, for the Americans playing at home, that's rugby, I guess, would probably be the easiest thing you guys know it. So just think NFL football without the pads, without the helmets to some extent. So he was quite a good player himself. As he grew up, he transitioned to coaching right when I was sort of, around that 4 or 5 mark. So I do remember as a little kid rolling down to training on a Tuesday and Thursday night, freezing cold, all rugged up, watching the big boys train, and I loved it. I love watching my dad out there having a good time and enjoying something that he could no longer do as a player, but found a different approach as a coach. And then also the boys. I think if you have grown up and around sport and your parents are involved as a coach or in the committee or something like that, as a kid, they almost welcome you as like part of the extended family. So I remember running the tee out. I don't know whether you guys have what the punters kick off, but over here for kickoffs and for goal kicks, we have what we call the tee. So as a little kid, I was a little tee boy. So I'd run out with the shirt all the way down past my knees, probably slipping over and doing all sorts of things, and run the tee out for the boys. Would fill the water bottles up on the benches, all those sort of little things that don't really mean anything. But as a kid, you just absolutely love being around that environment, being around with the big boys. And that's kind of, I guess, the first thing I remember as a kid being involved in sport would be my dad coaching, but then at home as well on the weekends. Back when we didn't have all these streaming services now that kids are so lucky to have. I'm sounding very old as I do this. But watching footy on TV, trying to stay up late, till 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, to watch the games. Would always fall asleep, not know who won, and then even I was saying this to someone the other day. We had to wait to get the paper the next day to see who won the game. So I'd cut out all the paper clippings and have my team there and make sure see who scored all the tries and all that sort of fun stuff. So I guess grew up in that era where it was just before everything became way too easy to have access to, where obviously now you can watch everything happen straight away or within a couple of seconds on Twitter or whatever it may be. So different times. Geez, I do sound old. And then from there, I actually, for some reason, the first sport I actually played was soccer. And I don't know why I played soccer. I actually have no idea at all. And again, somehow my dad got roped into coaching soccer, and he had no idea about soccer. And sure enough, lasted 1 year of playing that, loved it, and then played rugby league. And essentially from under eights, so it would have been around about 9 years old, give or take, through to when I was 22, played rugby league. So that was for the local team, which was the Caloundra Sharks. Shout out to those guys down there, where played majority of my junior football there. Was lucky enough along the way. Obviously, you meet coaches that help you out that you can really remember. Parents, players. It's crazy to think about if you go back and try to find all your old team photos, seeing who was actually in the team and what they've gone on to do and those sorts of things is pretty crazy. The area that I grew up is the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and for such a small, quote unquote, small area, it does produce a lot of really talented rugby league athletes who go and play professional. And so we were lucky enough to play against a lot of those guys and also play with them. So that was pretty cool to see some of those guys go on and do some really good things in the game. Unfortunately, I just played some representative level, so nothing too extreme. Think like a state team would probably be the best way to probably describe it. And that was through, when you start to make those representative teams around that, under 13s, 14s, 15s, where things start to become a little bit more seriously, or take it a bit more seriously, I should say. And I guess when you sort of get to that point, you are faced with one or two things. Either you really go all in on it, or you sort of happy to be on the cusp and sort of know that, you may want to do it, but you're not going to be as dedicated as some of those other guys. And in hindsight, and it's always good having hindsight, probably falling back, I was in that second group because I was playing footy, but I was also, surfing and doing all these other bits and pieces where you look at some of those boys that went on and made it, that was their main thing, I think for a lot of, young kids that are looking at it, you do unfortunately have to make a decision pretty early on whether is this going to be the thing you really want to have a red hot crack at. I don't have any regrets from that standpoint around not making it the main thing. Um, but it would have been good to have someone grab me and go, look, if you really want to do it, these are the things you have to do to sort of take it to the next level and become the player or the person that you want to or that you want to be or that the team want to have. Um, so it wasn't really until probably around about that grade 10 in school where I was introduced to gym. And for me, I was always a bit more of a scrawny, skinnier kid and relied on being probably a little bit more skillful and a bit more faster than other people. Um, and then when the gym rolled around in one off season, so period from around about November through to February, I think I put on like 8 kilos and came back.
Oh
And
wow.
all of a sudden, when I was coming into contact and making these tackles, I felt so much more confident in myself to do that. Where before, that may have been one of my limiting factors in the game was the contact side of things. I had a bit of a nickname sometimes. I was called Matt, doormat, because I just let players run over the top of me. Probably not the best to be having.
Right,
Um,
right.
so when I sort of found that as an option, it became that was the thing. Like we'll go to the gym, 4, 5, 6 times a week as much as we could around training. That was obviously the big thing, and just train. And we had no idea what we were doing at all. Um, and I think that's a really important point to make. Is there was some of the boys that I played with who were the most talented rugby league players. Um, but with the training they were doing away from the sport in the gym, as an example, they were getting big like bodybuilders, and bodybuilders unfortunately aren't the best athletes on the field. And ultimately, they ended up doing things that they shouldn't have done because their body was probably under too much stress in regards to they put on too much size too quick, or they weren't training the full compound movements and they were training things in isolation. So um, one of the boys ended up rupturing his pec like 3 or 4 times. And as a 15, 16-year-old, you're not meant to rupture your pec. Another one
Yeah,
did,
yeah.
I think, 3 or 4 ACLs. Again, as a young male in particular, doing your ACL once, you can kind of understand that maybe it's a bit of bad luck, but then two, three, four, and then you correspond
Yeah.
that with the type of training that we were doing at that time. You can sort of put two and two together. It doesn't really take a genius. Um, so when I sort of figured that out, paired with when I got injured when we were in my first proper rep team at around about 18, I really developed that passion for the training side of things and understanding that this can be both a blessing, like it was to me, but also a curse, like it was to some of these other guys that really should have went and been professional athletes and would have had completely different careers and completely different lives if that had happened. So um,
Mhm.
that was a really interesting point for me to learn and to make. And then when we were in that team, unfortunately, I got hurt at training and I didn't do an ACL, luckily, but a very high grade MCL, dislocated kneecap, like a bunch of bad stuff. So I was
Yeah.
on the in the brace for around about 3 or 4 months. So I actually missed the whole season of the representative side, but um, was doing all the strength conditioning in the gym because the guy that was running it couldn't get there in time. So he would just send me a message, chuck this up on the whiteboard, and you're good as gold, go for it. Um, so that was my first experience of sort of being thrown in the deep end around looking after a team environment. Um, and we really built a really good culture around lifting. I learned some very important things in the early days around about building energy in the gym, sort of giving the
Mm.
boys the why around why we're doing things that may not be what they were used to or what they were used to seeing. I think Generation Iron or Pumping Iron, that the
Yep,
bodybuilding
yep.
movie, that was really big at the time when we were 18, 19, 20. And so a lot of the boys would refer to that. You see the boys and they're juiced up and they're jacked and they're doing all this isolation stuff. And that's what the boys thought was training. So that was a really big educational piece for me to learn. Well, this is what the average punter, if you want to call them that, knows. So how can we slowly start to shift that perspective or shed light on what actually training is, and the correct ways to train? Um, and then so corresponding that at the same time, I was studying at uni. You can call it studying. I was at uni, not doing a whole lot of studying, just getting by. And then also working as a personal trainer. So when you layer those three things in, you've got the team setting with the boys, where I guess you're learning one element of coaching. At university, you're learning um, obviously how to decipher decipher information in a little bit
Mhm.
more, I guess, a higher manner. And then as a personal trainer, you're dealing with a lot of people. You might be dealing with a mum who's just gone through a divorce, and you're 18 and they're trying to tell you about these things around their divorce, and you're like, yep, yep,
Yeah.
yep. You got no idea
Yeah.
what they're going. You've got an 80-year-old lady, for example, who just wants to be able to move and be able to carry her groceries inside in one go. Down to you've got a youth athlete who's a hockey player, who's a goalie, to all these variety of clients that sort of, um, I guess, adds more bows to your coaching um, reservoir of things to do. So you combine those three things, and that was probably I guess, a really interesting intro into what the coaching side of things was, um, and trying to put those three things together at once, but then also that really built the foundation around, I guess, some of my beliefs around coaching, the interpersonal side of things, how to decipher information and break it down so that the average punter would understand it. So that's a bit of a winded intro there around that.
Yeah, that was awesome. I got a bunch of stuff here to sort of touch on. I guess I want to go back a little bit to when, well, I guess all the way to the beginning when you were talking about how you first started to get involved in rugby, I guess, and you talked about sort of being around that environment, being around the boys, and really immersing yourself into that. So as we know, like the times have sort of changed in the regard of how kids start to get involved into sports, into training, in working out, whatever it might be. How do you feel that that sort of dynamic that you had allowed you to grow into the person that you are now? Meaning, getting into sports and getting into the fundamentals of exercise and how that really like changed your life. Because obviously, I feel like that kickstarted your start to sports.
Yeah, 100%, mate. I think probably comes down to two parts. The first part being that um, I quite often in any circumstance, even now that I haven't played for a couple of years, you still think about that whatever you do in a, let's say I'm an employee here and we've got a team of 20 people, that's my team now, right? And there's going to be moments where the head coach is going to rip you in, head coach being the boss, and you
Yep.
just sort of sit back and go, okay, well, I understand why this has gone on. Or there's moments when there's going to be the players going at each other, i.e., myself and a coworker might have a disagreement. But at the end of the day, we know that once we leave the gym, that's like leaving the field. It's all left there. We go home and it's all good. We're teammates. So I've actually tried to carry that team first or team approach into everything that I do. Um, and that's really served me really well. And I think that if you understand that you're a part of a team and it's that team first mentality, you build those connections deeper. You are actually a little bit more empathetic and understanding around what your coworkers may be going through as well, rather
Right.
than seeing things on face value. And I've actually noticed a correlation between people that have never played sport who have the maybe a completely different view or played individual sports, so that
Mm,
be like say track and field or swimming or something like that, where it's almost the opposite, where they put themselves first above the team, or they don't or can't appreciate what someone else might be seeing. um, and I find that quite fascinating, quite interesting, the correlation between those two things there. I don't know whether you guys have that same approach or have seen a similar sort of trend, but it's quite interesting when you break it down to understand, okay, well, what was someone's, I guess, what were the levels of sport they were involved in? Were they part of a team? Were they part of multiple teams? Were they part of teams that had different backgrounds, ethnicities, ages, genders,
right.
all those sorts of things? Because that creates, I guess, a very different individual versus someone that may have been, let's just say, a boxer or a swimmer or something like that.
Yep.
Is that something you
For
guys
sure.
have seen?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And I think like you touched on this a few times about the environment in the gym and the sort of competitive nature that you're able to build. And I think that it does come down to the personal level of each person, right? Because obviously for a team environment, like it's an accumulation of all of the personalities that are on that team that are in the gym all at that one time. And the energy that a team is able to produce when they're in there all training at the same time is really it gives you the end result. Like if you have a team with low energy and they go into the gym and they're sort of going through the motions, like you already know what the result's going to be. Like they're going to be losing games or whatever it might be. But and Dylan can attest to this too. Like we're both hockey players. When you're in the gym with your team and everybody's getting after it and everybody's creating energy and they're pushing the guy next to them, like that's what creates winning environments and winning teams. And honestly, like it pushes the personal growth too. Like I think putting the team first is ultimately what triggers the personal growth on an individual level. You know what I mean?
100%. And I think the other thing too is what athlete A will be inspired by or want to work more towards, and the way that you frame that is very different to athlete B, right? And that can be the exact same as a boss talking to employees. You know, you can't have a blanket approach when you're trying to get a message across, because while it might fire one person up, the other person just sits back and goes into their shell being like, you can't talk to me, you can't spray me and expect to go, oh, I'm all good and walk away, where that person might think far out and that hangs over them for 3 or 4 days. So your communication styles have to adapt based on the person in front of you. And I think team sports sets people up so good to learn those interpersonal dynamics
Hmm.
and those relationships around how you communicate to a team. But then also, what I might say to the teams might be quite general, or maybe sitting in the middle, and then I might grab my captain or my leadership group and say, you know, you got to go do this, you got to go do that. I need you to do this, and see how, like, I need you versus can you do this is just a very different way of approaching something, and that's how you get the best out of your team. Um, and I think that's probably, if I did have one strength, would be trying to find out what the other person, whether that be a coworker, an athlete, even some of our partnerships, strategic partnerships that we have here. When you're talking to another person, a different company, what will help me get on their side and see their point of view? Because once I can see that and understand that, everything becomes so much easier. And again, that's not always as easy as just like that. That can take a lot of time.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people may not see the value of delayed gratification. If I
Mm.
create a relationship today, I can't expect to get something from them tomorrow. It might take 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years even before you can actually potentially get what you want out of that individual, or what they want to get out of you. But
Right.
to understand that it's a time trade off. If you invest in people around you, typically that reward comes back at some point in time.
100%. And to touch on that too, I some of the most successful and the best coaches that I've had personally, like Joey said, we're both hockey players. Some of the best coaches we've had have taken the time to get to get to know their players on a personal level and find, what really makes them tick. How are they going to perform their best? And, like you said, yelling, screaming, the hardo coach might be great for some players and you get a great response out of that. And like you said, it might shut another player out. So, the best coaches know how to interact with the individual to get the best team result. And I think that's critical. And, there's so many life lessons that can be learned from sport and applied to the real world, applied to, work, whatever it is, as a strength coach. I think there's so many life lessons that people that don't play team sports, they really miss out on that. It can have such a big impact.
100%. And then I think, going back to the second point, around what did that environment cultivate? It cultivated being physically active. Like,
Mm.
you go to school and then straight away I go to footy or I go to training. Like, there was no, I go home and, hang around and watch TV and stuff like that. It was like, no, you go from school and you go straight to training every single day. That was the day, except for
Yep.
Wednesdays. That was the one day that you wouldn't do that. You know what I mean? So you didn't have time to worry about these other things. It created that in the early days a lot of discipline around, school, and sport. They were like the two things that you essentially had. Um, and I guess a lot of kids these days miss out on that opportunity around being able to go and play sport,
Mm.
because they might have all these other things going on, which is obviously completely fair, but you miss out on those opportunities around creating discipline. You're going to get people in a team, even as a young kid, that you may not quote unquote like or get along with, but you have to learn to. You're going to have coaches that you may not like typically,
Mhm.
or whatever else, and you have to learn to get along with them. So there's a lot of lessons, as we mentioned already, that go circle back full 360 that you learn, as an 8, 9, 10-year-old that you take with you. So some form of team sport should be on every young kid's agenda at some point in time, to at least experience. And you know what? You do it for a year and you say, that wasn't for me, but geez, I learned 3 or 4 things out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. And it is tough though, because I think the dynamic has definitely changed, especially in youth sports, in my opinion. I mean, I'm 22 years old, so I can only speak from a certain amount of years. You know what I mean? But at least from the people that we've talked to, we had this one guest we had on a while back. He played Division 1 college football, and he's in his 50s now. And he talked about how when he was younger, there was such a limited access to knowledge. I mean, there was no internet, there was nothing like that. So people were hungry to try and find ways to improve, and they're trying all these different training techniques. And whereas nowadays we have all the information we could possibly have at the tips of our fingers, but the kids aren't as like, I don't know if it's just because of they have it in front of them, so they're not like trying to find it. But I feel like there's this sort of competitive nature that is sort of dwindled over the years. Or what's your opinion on that? Because I'm curious. Because obviously we're in two different countries, so I'd be curious to know what it's like over there. And I don't know if you work with youth players at all, but in general, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give like my personal take as a coach and someone who's grown up obviously playing sport, and then also
Yeah.
what we're seeing with the youth athletes that we work with now as well, because that's probably a good insight from their perspective. But I think for me, it's almost a paralysis by analysis, right? Like there is so much information that kids are like, I can learn this or I can do that, and it's just it almost we are in a time of over information, so you've got to decipher what's good and what's bad, and sometimes you don't know the difference, and that's I think we all fall into that trap sometimes. We see something or read something, and go, oh, that's unreal. um, but back in the day, as you're probably speaking to that athlete before, there was only certain resources available, whether that you had to go to the library or whatever it may be to get them. And then once you get them, you were so excited to do it. Whereas now it's like, oh, if it's not that one, I'll get it from the next one, or I'll get it from the next one. And it sort of falls down that trap. And I think for me growing up, it was kind of a bit like that. There was a one, this wasn't even on DVD; it was on VHS tape that I'd rewind, go back and watch, and it was around how to kick and things like that. And they were that was hard to find versus now. Like you just type into YouTube, torpy kicking techniques, and there'll be thousands and thousands and thousands. So I think it probably goes one or two ways. The kids that are really keen can really dive down that rabbit hole and get obsessed almost. Kobe talked about being obsessed with watching Michael Jordan tapes and things like that, versus the kids that maybe probably going back to before, a bit like myself, that was somewhat interested, somewhat may not be interested, can kind of look at it and go, oh, yeah, I understand that. And then that's it. They leave it. So it probably has
Mm,
its pros and cons. Um, but then it's a matter of deciphering the information around what is good and what is not. And I think that's probably the hardest thing. The other thing that in Australia that's quite common now is kids will have their team sport, but then they might go and get a specific coach, even in rugby league, that might be their kicking coach or their passing coach or their skills coach or something like that. um, which I think, again, the kids that either have the ability to get those sort of resources through financial means or sponsorships or whatever it may be, that can really be another added value because they're getting the targeted skill development that they need. Which back in the days where with me, I just generally didn't know anyone that would go and seek specific skill coaching for those sorts of things. So again,
right.
they're getting exposed to these different elements and layers that um, is just phenomenal for kids to have access to. And then I think from the athletes that come in here, um, they are kind of probably spread across a couple of things. They've got a couple of sports going on, and then they have to make that decision which one do they want to dive down on, or niche down in, whatever you really want to call it. And then it becomes probably what I've seen a lot of is, does it become the thing I still love to do, or does it become the thing I just do? And
Mm,
that leads to ultimately that burnout. There's a one of my good mates from back home. His sister was, and they'd be happy for me to share the story, was one of the best up and coming surfers in Australia. She was an absolute freak. Was winning competitions left, right, and center. At 14 or 15, was traveling the world on not the WSL but the circuit below it, and was competing and winning, going very, very, very well. Had sponsorships from some of the top brands in the world, um, doing absolutely phenomenal. And then one day she just woke up and goes, I don't want to surf anymore because I've fallen out of love with it. And then she just stopped. That was it. And so you look at that and go, has surfing lost a phenomenal athlete there? Bloody oath. But more importantly, she fell out of love with the thing that she grew up doing. The moment she could
yeah.
stand up, she was surfing. So it's kind of like that trend of, you can specialize so much, but then if it takes away the love of the game, well, then what's the point in doing it? Um, And I think that we can fall down that specialization trap. And I know everyone speaks about it, but it is so true. You fall down that specialization trap and it just doesn't become enjoyable anymore. And I think that's the thing that you look at, like LeBron, you look at Tom Brady, all these athletes, Messi, the guys that have been at the top of their sport for so long, it's still a game to them and they still find ways to make it really enjoyable. And that's
Yep.
probably the secret that they leave behind is they were trying to do all these tiny little things to make themselves just that little bit better every year to still be in love with the game and not let the game
Mhm.
take over their lives.
Right.
And that's really
Yeah.
important from maybe from an identity standpoint. You know, I don't think LeBron identifies himself as a basketball player. He identifies himself as a basketball player, a father, a businessman, all these different elements to his persona, which essentially creates LeBron. He's not just a basketball player. So if he
Hmm.
has a bad basketball game, he's not down. He might be down for a little bit, but then he goes home, he's got his family, or he's got a business project to work on. So for the youth athletes, they just identify themselves as I am Jordi and I play rugby. And if I have a bad rugby game, world's falling down. If I have a good rugby game, like let's go, I can do anything. And that becomes really hard because when you get to the sort of the age that I was, say around about that 20, where if you haven't gone pro by 20, you're not really going to go anywhere. It's very unlikely. All of a sudden now my whole identity growing up was playing sport and now I don't play sport. You almost hit like a midlife crisis, but way before your midlife crisis because you just
Right.
don't know what
Yeah.
you are anymore. And that's really,
Mhm.
really hard. So you kind of get both ends of that spectrum. You either fall out of love with the game you played in the early days, or when you get to the point where quote unquote retire or whatever it may be, you don't take it as seriously, you almost lose a little bit of yourself at that back end as well, where you just don't know what you are anymore. So sport is amazing. It can be a blessing and a curse and everything in between. I think it's just like everything, right? You just have to identify where you're at, try to find these things that can make you that little bit, I guess, better in what am I trying to achieve at this point in time in my career, or you know, if I miss out on a rep team, it's okay. There's going to be more as I get older. There's all these
Yeah.
factors, and I think the more that people can speak about that, and the young kid can see themselves in someone who maybe didn't make the rep team but then went and turned pro, or
Yep.
did come from a really poor home environment but then went pro, they can see themselves in these athletes, and then those athletes can share the story because there's no point in us three talking about it when we haven't done it. We can
Right. Yeah.
hypothesize and guess and things like that and maybe shed a little bit of light on it. But ultimately, we're not the ones out there, you know, making millions of dollars and inspiring these kids. It needs to come from those athletes.
Mhm.
So it's cool. That's why I personally love LeBron so much because he shares all those stories and he gives back. And if kids can see themselves coming from that home life or whatever it may be, that they can see
Yep.
themselves becoming that. So there's so much value in athletes trying to share their story and giving back from that standpoint as well.
Yeah. And a part of this, like, it goes back to the whole just flooding of information that we have now. I think like kids nowadays, and obviously, like you said, like this is just hypothesizing and creating conversation, but I think that part of the problem is like there's this sort of awareness around how zoned in you have to be on your sport to be able to make it. That's why kids are starting to specialize younger and younger and younger every year, and they're not getting the benefits of playing multiple sports for a prolonged period of time. You know what I mean? And part of that has to do with social media and the videos they see about, you know, going hard 24/7 and doing this, doing that, and if you don't do that, you're not going to make it. And I think that's creates that identity crisis where if that doesn't work out, things fall apart. You know what I mean? And it's sad to see, but the ones that do make it in the end, besides the one percenters or even the 0.1 percenters, are the ones that have a balance and that create this, you know, long lasting effect of improving in different facets of life instead of just identifying in that one category in one sector of life.
100%. I think. Have you guys read the book Outliers?
That's actually about one of the books I'm reading this summer, believe it or not.
So if you're a kid, it's great read, even as a coach and parent, to be fair, around some of the outliers in sport, and sometimes it's just up to chance around what whether you get lucky in genes or you get lucky in the environment that you're raised in. Like there is so many things that go on throughout a athlete's or a coach's or whatever it may be journey as they grow up, that sometimes it is just chance that you get into those situations as well. You may have two parents that are just absolute athletic freaks, and you are lucky enough to get those genes. You may grow up next to a soccer field and you're a soccer player. Like there's all these things that just happen. Um, by pure fluke and pure chance that ultimately create that individual. So yeah, there's so many factors to it. But like one of the things here in Australia that when I present on youth, a youth, I guess, a couple of presentations that I built out is, and this shocks a lot of the coaches in the room, especially, is that for using just rugby league because that was my main area. If you look at the kids that are born in the first half of the year, so calendar year from January through to June, what percentage of those do you think end up making it in the NRL, which is the professional league over here, versus July to November, make it professionally? What are the percentages?
Hmm.
Have a guess.
I have no idea. I don't even know where to guess on that.
I'm guessing the first half is a lot greater than the second half,
Correct.
probably
73%.
substantially. Yeah. Hmm.
73% of the NRL was born, and this is when that study was done. So please, if you're out there and you're looking at that, don't come at me if it's slightly off. But that was when that done, which I believe was 2016, was that particular data set that I refer to because it is just so impactful. So,
Wow.
even as simple as
Almost three quarters. That's
where you're born,
crazy.
where you're born in the year can have such an impact
Wow.
on, because you think about that, you're born January 1, and one of my mates is, so good on him. Um, and I'm born November the 3rd. He's essentially 11 months older than me. And now, whilst that doesn't sound too crazy, if you're 13 or 14, you know how
Yeah.
quickly that can be, um, from a growth and maturation standpoint. That's the world, because he might go through um, that maturation period 6, 8 months before me. And then if I'm a slow developer and he's an early developer, it could be almost 2 to 3 years difference between
Even
the
more
two,
significant. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
right? And so you wonder why, these kids, and then at that age, at 13 and 14, when it is so important, and he's bigger, stronger, and faster, as an example, of course he's going to get picked in the representative teams because he's bigger, stronger, and faster. He actually looks like a kid that is going to grow into a really good athlete.
Yep.
Then he has the eyes of the selectors on him from 13. He has developmental clubs that are, looking to sign kids at that age. He's got all these other little bits and pieces. So straight away now, nothing except for when he was born versus me. We're in the same team, the exact same environment. He's got all these advantages purely by when he was born in the year.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah. And that
So
I
it's
mean
crazy.
that creates confidence too. Like if he's significantly more skilled or more powerful or whatever it might be, everybody knows that those physical effects has a mental effects as well. Like the confidence somebody like that would have is even more significant and propels their career that much further too.
Absolutely. And I guess the only flip side to that is if you are a late developer or someone who may be born the back end of the year, it does give you the chance to be a little bit more of a tactical weapon. So you
Mm,
might be a little bit more skillful and not rely on your sheer, size and power and things like that, which then, when I guess the playing field even outs, quote unquote, around like that 16s, sort of the playing field sort of evened out a little bit and everyone's sort of developed fully. Typically you may have the advantage then, but in some circumstances, unfortunately, that's almost too late. They've
yeah,
already identified these athletes as being key people that they want to have in their teams or their systems and things like that. So
right.
I know that's a bit of a roller coaster going around a few of those points, but it's absolutely crazy around what you're dealt, the hand you've been dealt, whether you can really use that to your advantage, or it can be a disadvantage, or you can look at it as, okay, I'm not dealt that hand, so what can I do to set me up, and
Right.
really, I guess, build those weaknesses up.
Yeah, and now I have an interesting take on this as well, kind of to add on to your points is like so going back, I guess, to the surfer. I forget her name that you had mentioned previously, but someone who's winning repeatedly over and over and over again without facing the adversity of defeat, without facing the adversity of injury, I feel like those are the ones that end up burning out quicker because the ones that create more satisfaction from victory are the ones that have experienced defeat, have experienced, those low times of trial and tribulation. And then when they experience victory and when they experience themselves growing into an athlete that they desired at the time of when they were at their low point, that creates a sort of urgency to push even further. Like I can make this happen. I've failed and now I've succeeded and I'm going to keep going with that. You know what I mean? Like I feel like there is a fine line, like you mentioned. You're powerful and more strong with that whole age differentiation. But a couple years down the line, where those kids who were more average or whatever it might be, who have experienced defeat and have gone through certain things that those kids who are stronger went through, that's got to create some sort of like personality traits that allows them to push even further without burning out soon, you know?
Absolutely. You're essentially just building resilience, right? You're building more resilient
Yeah.
athletes, but you're also building more resilient humans. Um,
Mm.
and that can come from sport or it can come from other circumstances as well. And sometimes when a kid has a setback at say 15 and they might, let's say, unfortunately do a serious injury like an ACL, or they might, do something to their shoulder and it's an extended period of time away from sport. Whilst that can be the hardest thing in their life at that point in time, it can be also the biggest blessing because it gives
Mm-hmm.
them a perspective around, the sport itself and, almost a little bit of a sit back and I can look at it from a different angle around what I'm doing with myself. But B, it gives them that chance to look at themselves and go, these are all the areas I need to work on or improve on.
Mm-hmm.
And if you, as you said, don't have that chance to ever step back away from always winning or always rolling through rep team to rep team, and then you know when it gets to the point where you do, let's say, make your debut or you're a rookie and then you get hurt, it's like the world comes crashing down times a
Yeah.
million
Mhm.
because you
Right.
have never been faced with that adversity. And there's probably multiple stories you guys can think of that I can think of guys and girls that have been professional athletes and maybe only lasted 1 or 2 years because the toll of what that environment around things that maybe not be going their way is just too hard for them to handle. And they haven't built
Mm-hmm.
up that resilience or they haven't had that support network around them, whether they have a mental skills coach that they went through because, I'm 14 and all the boys are bigger than me and they're running over top of me. So I just needed someone to sort of talk me through that and how we can make some strategies around, building my confidence up, or a coach or a physio that can help them with their injuries or performance because they never had to worry about it because they were always the biggest, strongest, and fastest just naturally. Just by
Mhm.
looking at
Right.
weights, they got bigger, which definitely isn't me. But you've got those sorts of things, right? Where unfortunately, those little setbacks can also be the biggest blessings in your athletic career because it does create a different perspective, creates a different environment around you of support network, which you never know when you need to or can rely on that network of support again later on down the track.
I couldn't agree more. We've talked about this before on the podcast too, though. Injuries can be a bit of a blessing in disguise. No one wants to have an injury. You don't wish an injury upon anyone, but we've talked before how, like you said, it can give you a different perspective. It allows you to look at, okay, how else can I improve? Okay, I can't, say it is an ACL injury. Okay, I can't run or squat. How can I train my upper body? How can I train my mental game? It really allows you to diversify, your skill set. And one example, I think we've shared this story before too, was so there's an up and coming hockey player, Connor Bedard. He's the number one rated draft pick for the NHL this year. And he broke his wrist at 12 years old, so he wasn't able to shoot. And he, well, couldn't take forehand shots. I'm not sure how familiar you are with hockey, but couldn't take snapshot on his forehand. So only could take backhands. Well, it turned into just a deadly release, and he changed the way he shot, and it impacted his release. And now he is one of the most powerful and quickest releases in the game. And he always refers back to how it started because he was injured, and it allowed him to change the way he shot in order to do so. And it just goes to show, like, an injury really can be a blessing in disguise and just a different way to enhance your skills.
100%. The My favorite photo is the photo of Kobe in his pajamas when he's got the cast on the right on his shooting arm and he's just shooting the ball left-handed. And it's like that was the
Yep.
day he got out of
Yep.
hospital or whatever it was. And it's like whenever, especially a kid gets hurt, because the other element to a kid getting hurt that we haven't really touched on is obviously the parents go through a little bit of like quote unquote
Mm,
trauma as well, because it might be the first time they've seen their kid away from sport, or not, doing the thing they love to do, or even catastrophizes in their own head, because if you've got that crazy helicopter parent that floats around all the time,
yeah.
it's almost like they got injured. And it's like, hang on a
Yeah.
second,
Yeah.
you're not injured. It's your son or your daughter. Just step back, relax. It's all good. Um, but I love to send that photo out to them and being like, look, I know this sucks. Unfortunately, it is a part of sport. It's a part of life that things aren't going to go your way, but it's how you frame that to them, and how
Yep.
and you know what, sulk for a week, be upset about it, because I would do the exact same thing. Like, take the time you need to go, this genuinely sucks. Once you come out of that, now look at all the opportunities of the things you can work on.
Right.
Not going to be easy, not going to be fun at times, but there is so much you can do. And I just love sending that photo of Kobe to people, and just saying, look, it's up to you now, really, what you do off the back of this.
Yeah.
And a great example, you sort of use the hockey player in Australia. We have the A League Women's, which is essentially the top tier soccer competition.
Hmm.
And one of the girls who unfortunately did her ACL at Matilda's camp, which is the national program, it was the first, and she was 20, maybe 21 or 22. It was the first time in her whole life she ever took extended time away from soccer, because
Wow.
here they go from season to season. So essentially, you play the national competition, you then play in the state competition, national competition, state
Hmm.
competition, and there is no off season. It's crazy, and they might
That
play
is crazy.
2 games a week, 3 games a week in some circumstances. Like, it's ridiculous. I don't know any other sport in the world that would do that. It's absolutely crazy. And rightly so, she was devastated. But once got past that initial phase, and looked at it as, this is a crazy opportunity now. This is the first time in your life you're ever going to have an off season, ever. You've never had an off season before. So, this is a really good time to work on, and the physio crew did a fantastic job mapping out, these are the things we're going to work on, whilst you're obviously going to recover from your ACL. And, we've got our timeline mapped out of when your first return to run is, all these protocols around what we want your strengths and injuries to be at, all these sorts of things. Let's have a crack at building some upper body size here. Let's have a crack at building a really robust trunk. Let's have a crack at getting your conditioning underway and building a really solid
Hmm.
base there. And all of a sudden, this whole different world of opportunity opened up. And touch wood, she's been back playing in the pros again, and doing a fantastic job. And I don't know now whether she'd still say it was a blessing in disguise. She'd probably just say it sucked. But
Yeah.
maybe, later on down the track, that she will go back and say, that was a really interesting time of my sporting career. It gave me a different perspective, like we mentioned before, on certain things. And that 9 months potentially extended my career by 3 years, because it gave me time away to mentally refresh. I came back, a bit of a different athlete in maybe the way that I approached the game, because I know that when she went back and started doing her technical stuff, things that were working before just didn't feel the same. So that was adapted and changed a little bit. So
Hmm.
it's an interesting kettle of fish, and you really don't know. Hindsight's 2020 for a reason. You really don't know what the effects that has, until, I guess, you look back on it.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's like Dylan said earlier too, like injuries are just so difficult to get through, but I think just seeing the opportunity in every situation, I mean, it's so cliche, but I feel like, and it's easier said than done, like especially when you're in the moment. Like when you're out of it, you're like, "Oh yeah, like that was a great chance to, make improvements in other areas." But when you're in it, it's like there's a cloud around you. It's so difficult to get through, but I want to hear a little bit more about your coaching perspective. I know we've touched on a few different areas. One being, I guess, the navigating the waters of the internet and how much access to information we have nowadays. And I think it's more difficult than ever for athletes in particular to be able to figure out what is right for them. So for my hockey career, and I know Dylan can attest to this as well, like we sort of have these coaches over time, strength coaches that they create programs for us for our teams, and we sort of figure out what works for us on an individual level, and then we keep doing that over periods of time. How important is it in your programming and working with athletes and or whoever's training at your facility or whoever you train? How important is it for you to get across to them that everything's different like things work differently for every individual, and nothing is going to be the same for every individual. And I feel like it's the same thing for nutrition as well. One thing that might work for one person isn't going to work for another person.
It comes down to a couple of things. I think going back to the first point in that question around the abundance of information,
Yep.
as a coach, you'll probably face with one or two things. You're either programming or you're coaching, and they're two very different things. Because I can program, so I can give Dylan a program, and it can be a really really good program. Don't get me wrong, and I can give you the exact same program, Joy, but I'm going to coach you through that program. I'm going to essentially, look for those intricate little details around the way that you move and maybe change
Hmm.
a few things on the fly and things like that. They're two very different things, which I think is a blessing and a curse again because it gives Dylan access to a program that he would never have access to before. But I know that hand on my heart, I give Dylan the program he does on his own versus me and Joey go in the gym and we do it together for 4 weeks. We're going to get better results, even if everything else remained the same, the exact same training times, the exact same weight, size, all these sorts of things. If all the constants remain the same, but you had the coach with you, getting that actual experience and hands-on approach, you're going to get better results.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, they actually never had the ability to get a good program either. So that in itself is also amazing that now athletes all around the world can get a program from someone. And yes, it's not going to be the same as being with them in the room, but it is the next best thing. So I think that's really important to understand as an athlete. There's a difference between, or a coach even, there is a difference between programming and coaching. And there's a difference between implementing a program yourself and having, a quote unquote expert be there with you and get the hands on coaching that you sort of need or that you may be after. And so when you're an athlete and you're looking for those services, understand the difference and have realistic expectations. And as a coach, the exact same thing applies. Like, be realistic with your athletes. If I do, and only have a handful here and there of athletes that I sort of look after remotely, I'd be straight up honest with them at the start. It's not going to be the same as working with me in person. I would love to be able to do that. If you want to fly me over to America, let's do it. I'd love to. But unfortunately, that's probably not the reality of it all. So it's going to be the next best thing that I can offer. But if there is a coach in your area that you think could be just as good or slightly better or whatever else, please go and work with them. I'm a big believer in that it's not about being selfish as a coach around trying to say, I worked with X athlete and this was great. Who cares? Like at the end of the day, it's about giving the athlete the best experience possible.
Hmm.
Both financially because they're investing their money in that if it's a private coach, but also their time. You want to make sure that if they're only got 3 hours a week to be in the gym, they're getting the best 3 hours a week that they can possibly get.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that for a lot of kids that go out and they look at programs online, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, all these places where you get that quick hits of information, that can be really hard to decipher. So if you put on
Yeah.
that hat, am I getting a program or am I getting coaching? You can sort of, I guess, filter out a little bit and then understand what you're getting yourself into. And is that what you're after? And if it's not, that's completely okay. Just be aware of it that it may not be the thing that you're after. And then, as always, do your due diligence. Ask around what other athletes have worked with them. If they say they've worked with athletes, other coaches. Try to get a really good understanding around the person that you're going to be working with. And I think that goes then to the second part of the question around when I'm trying to get, I guess, like quote unquote athlete buy-in. I don't really care about anything to do with them from a performance standpoint, the way they move, the way they jump, until I get to know who they are, what makes them tick. Obviously, don't take that literally. Like, I do care how they move, but
Right.
80% of my energy is going to go into them as a person because if they don't know, and the old cliche, you don't know how much you know until you know how much you care. If they don't know that I genuinely care about them as a person, who cares if I tell them how to squat? They can go and learn how to squat from a million other people in the world. It's the connection you build with the athlete, and I think that's what makes coaching so special. Is you've got a handful of athletes that you get to work with, whether that be in a team setting, in an individual setting, from all these different walks of life, that you get to make these genuine connections with. Some may go and turn professional. That's absolutely unbelievable. Some may retire, and you get to give them an extra year of their career that they may not have had. That's just as good. Some may just be playing local A grade level, but that's they're being the best athlete they can possibly be. And if you're invested with the journey around where they want to go and how they get there, that's what makes coaching so special. And then once you've built that connection, and sort of going back to it before again, if we're in that team environment, it may take only 2 sessions before you sort of get a good grasp, and they're you can feel
Yeah.
that connection building. It might take 2 weeks. It might take 2 months. Like, you just don't know, and you can't put a definitive timeline on that. The only thing you can do is the more you do it, the better you get at it. Um, but there's always going to be outliers. I'm sure there's some people out there that are just,
Yeah.
hard to crack. And then from there, once you've got that buy-in, you can then start to talk the technical jargon and the things that maybe will improve their performance a little bit more in a little bit more depth from there. But I think that's really important for me to is have that connection, number one. Without that, you don't have anything. And then you can build your
Yeah.
program philosophies, your training systems, all these other things on top. Um, that's really important for me.
Yeah. And so now you have an interesting perspective coming from someone who has played sport and has also coached people who play sports. And this is why Dylan and I love talking to coaches, because you kind of get the best of both worlds. And I think since the dawn of time, everybody's been so focused on physical performance and training physically. How important do you think, especially in today's day and age, that the balance between mental performance and physical performance creates the end result of their performance on the field, on the ice, wherever it might be?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I think the more that we break down those barriers around, mental health and mental fitness and all these things, whatever you really want to call it, it's ultimately the
Hmm.
same thing. It's you've got your physical component, then you've also got your what goes on inside your head component. Um, and there is some fantastic professionals out there now doing work in that space that, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you couldn't fathom that that would be around and that athletes would be so open in talking around, the way they performed or barriers they may be facing come game day, or all these other things in life that can impact what happens on the field. Because at the end of the day, in rugby league, you only get to see 80 minutes a week of them playing on the field. You don't get to see, I'm not a mathematician, so I don't know the amount of other minutes left in the week, but there is so many more other minutes left in the week of that athlete that you don't get to see them on the field at all. And you have no idea what's going on in their personal life, in their professional life, at training, as an example, even if you want to call it from that standpoint. So there's all these factors that go into what you see being that finished product come game day that you simply have
Hmm.
no idea about. And now the fact that athletes are speaking up around that, this part of my game is really, really important. It kind of goes back to what we were saying before around you want to see athletes that you admire speak about that, because then it becomes the norm.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, that just takes time, and it takes some leaders to really step up and want to do that. And then as coaches, we just have to be able to facilitate that. So there's no point in putting your head in the sand and say, well, physical performance is so much more important than mental performance. I'm not going to worry about mental performance. Have a sort of, step to the side and go, okay, well, I might still believe that physical performance is 90% worth of an athlete's, you know, game day outcome. But
Right.
what if it was the 10% that they needed that day? I at least should
Hmm.
be aware and be able to have a conversation. And if it's not my cup of tea or thing I feel comfortable in speaking about, who do I have in my network that I could pass on to the athlete to say, this person's really good to go work with for X, Y, and Z. I think it'd be a really powerful conversation for you to have with this particular person.
Yeah.
Um, because I don't think athletes expect you as a coach to have all the answers all the
Yeah.
time. And I think sometimes we often burden ourselves with, oh fuck, I should have the answer for all these questions. The most powerful thing to say is, I don't know, I got no idea, but I'll find out for you. And then actually
Hmm.
going and finding out, or I'll find the person for you and then passing them on, because you're just building up, going back to before, more trust and more authentic communication with that athlete versus trying to, guess or make something up on the spot. Um, but yeah, going back to it is absolutely important. And especially for kids, if they can understand that, there's some coaches now I know that do gratitude practice after training. When
Hmm.
would you think
Yeah.
about gratitude practice as an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old after football training? A manly man sport, we tackle, we do these sorts of things. And now the coach is saying, hey guys, um, you know, name one thing you're really grateful for after training today. Or, name one thing, an affirmation, what are you today? Like, these things just didn't exist
Hmm.
prior.
Yeah.
So the barrier has to start at the bottom with the kids coming through, which I think it really is. Like, there is such a massive shift in that. And then at the top as well. with the athletes going through and continue to share their stories and some of the methods and practices that they use. Because ultimately, if you blend those two things together, it's like you're burning the candle at both ends, right? It's going to hit the middle at some stage. If you're burning it
Hmm.
from one end, it's just going to take a little bit longer. Um, so
Yeah.
whilst here, for example, like I comfortably would say that I'm not super uh, able to communicate those sort of messages. I've got people in my network that, you know, Joey, you come to me and you say, mate, I'm really struggling with my game day performance. I get on the field and I just feel like whatever I do is at 10 times speed and I just can't find my feet. Perfect. I know the exact person to put you in contact with.
Right.
And I think the other thing too is as a coach, if you have the opportunity, and obviously life is busy and things like that, but if you can jump in a room where, because it's probably going to make you feel a bit more comfortable if I'm your coach and I've been working with you for, say, 6 months to a year, and then we bring in that third person as well, that we all are in that room and we can all work through that together. You get a better understanding around some things that you probably never heard of from your perspective as an athlete, because you're probably a little bit more comfortable sharing that in that environment. It's not something you're going to talk about
Hmm.
on the gym floor, right? You get
Yeah.
a different perspective from the third party coming in saying, these are some strategies that you can use. And then you as a coach can go, far out, that was so simple, or such an easy thing for me to maybe, replicate later on down the track. Things for me to follow up with Joey, all these sorts of things that you can now use and add to your own tool belt. So I've said it multiple times. It's just your network really is so powerful in the way that you can present yourself as a professional, but also your day to day growth that you can get out of that, and your PD that you get every single day by surrounding yourself with people that is not your strength or things that you don't think about.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I do think you mentioned this a little while back about the whole just the balance piece. But I do think that physical performance, whether it's in the gym, on the field, at the rink, whatever it might be, it does have certain traits that trigger an improved mental performance, whether it's confidence, resiliency, discipline, like those things that are physical, those do help you mentally, whether, to go out there and be comfortable out there and know that you've done what you can do come game day, and you're like, okay, I've done the training, I've done the practicing, and now it's time to just lay it all out there. And I feel like the people that, and this is obviously just speaking by theory, but the people who do go out on game day and maybe they struggle to perform like they can in practice are the ones that aren't necessarily sticking to those rituals in practice of discipline, doing maybe it's an extra rep, an extra set, like those things they compound over time, and I think it builds way more confidence, because confidence is the biggest piece, in my opinion, to mental performance when it comes time to actually perform when it matters.
I couldn't agree more. We have a mental skills coach that we work with here called David King. Kingy's an absolute national treasure. He should be have a statue at the front of every stadium that he's worked at. So the thing that he works with athletes is, when it comes to that confidence that you're speaking about there, he has a saying that calls practice makes permanent, right? So
Mm.
I think of it like this, and I was having a chat to my girlfriend the other day because we're at the footy field, just mucking around, doing some run throughs and things like that, and I hadn't kicked a goal off a tee for, I don't know, a couple of years, and I set the tee up, and I still remembered my approach and all these sorts of things. Kicked it, missed it. If for those that were interested, I was standing there and I'm like, there is 400,000 things running through my head here, where a couple of years ago, I just set the tee up, walk back, kick it, walk off, wouldn't even think about it. Right. And it's the difference around, I haven't done it for so long. Like my not my brain, but the way that I do that has atrophied over time. Like, it's just not something I've done so long, and the practice isn't there.
Right.
So I can't expect the outcome to be the exact same as what it was before, when I was putting in all the extra work around, the approach, the contact, all these sorts of things. And can't expect the outcome to be the exact same if you're not putting in the work to get there. And that goes the same thing again, like we're passing the ball, and I could pass the ball 10, 15 meters left and right, not even think about it. And then I'd catch it and I'd be like, okay, I got to pass the ball here. Oh, I got to, and it's like, that would never cross my mind beforehand. Wouldn't even think about it. So I can't expect myself now, if I was to go and play game day and play well, you might get lucky and play well. There's a difference between
Yeah.
luck and practice actually coming off. Um, because I'd be thinking about things that I never would have thought about before, and you can't see the game in front of you, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that saying of practice makes permanent, when Kingy speaks about that, has always sort of stuck with me. a lot. And I think it's a really easy, like a mantra or quote to remember for athletes that, if you're not putting in that extra work in regards to whatever it may be, kicking, shooting, whatever it is, you can't expect yourself to come game day, nail it because you've done it in training once. It's like there's
Yeah,
a reason that Kobe missed a free throw, so he'd go and shoot 100 after a game in a row before he'd leave the stadium. Like there's a reason that these guys do that. So practice makes permanent.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that honestly sums it up, I think, to a T. Like that's literally exactly what I said in one sentence. You know what I mean? And it is easier said than done, but I think part of that is like the discipline aspect of actually doing it. Like there's that, and that's a whole other story to talk about of like the days you don't feel like doing it. Like you still got to do it. If it's a part of your routine, like it's got to be done, whether it's practice or it's a training day. Like just go in and do it. You're not always going to feel 100%. But anyways, that we've dove into a bunch of different topics, and it's been awesome. We always end, with one piece of advice, and I know that's a fully loaded question, but I guess one piece of advice that you think could be of value for somebody who's on the journey right now, who's an athlete and who's trying to make it to their next level, personally on an individual level.
Find either the athlete or person that you want to be, or aspire to be like, and get as bloody close to them as you possibly can. Whether you're an entrepreneur who wants to start a business and you want to try to get to the CEO, be an intern for 6 months. If you're an athlete who wants to be a professional basketball player, try to get as close as you can to your favorite player. You can't get them, get the next player, get the next player, get the next player, get the next player, get a
Hmm.
coach, whatever it may be. Get as close to you as those guys you possibly can. Two reasons: one, you learn what it actually takes to be the person you want to be, and if it's not for you, that is absolutely okay. There is nothing wrong in that, and you actually got to experience that in a way that you would never been able to experience before. And that's really, really important, because then you might learn, okay, that's not for me. I'm going to go try something else, and that might be for me. Second to that, it's osmosis. You're around that person or that environment or that team, you're just going to be the next person to make it. It's
Yeah.
just the next thing. So those two things: get as bloody close to the person you want to be as you can, and see how you go.
Yeah, I mean that's like the saying where surround yourself with five of the people that you want to be like, and you'll be the sixth. And I think it's 100% true. But that's great advice. That's perfect. Dylan, do you have any other questions that you want to ask him?
I don't think so. Jordy, it was great having you on. I mean, we dove into a lot of different topics, and I think there's a lot of things that our listeners can take away and benefit from, and whatever they're going through, sport, school, professional life. I think there's a lot of lessons that can be applied to their lives, then and they can benefit from it. So it was great having you on. We appreciate your time, and we'll stay in touch for sure.
No, I really do appreciate it, guys, and hopefully it wasn't too much dribble for everyone there. And
Well,
please feel free, anyone reach out if you want to chat or anything like that. I'm always open to it. Love connecting with people. Zach, same with you guys. Love chatting it up and learning more about what you guys do. So keep up the great work.
yeah, thank you. We appreciate that. And we like Dylan said, like we dove into a lot of different topics, and I feel like we had so much more to talk about too. But we'd love to have you on in the future when a couple of years down the line, you got a few more things in the works. We'd love to hear about what's going on. So we look forward to staying in touch, and good luck with everything.
Likewise, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, have a good
Take
one.
care, Jordy.